expressly for the lavish ceremony in which Napoleon would crown himself Emperor of the French. The stately march heard here would usher in a new era in post-revolutionary French politics. In the 5 years from the fall of the Directory in November of 1799 to Napoleon's grandiose coronation in December of 1804, much had changed in the government of France. Gone were the overtly egalitarian virtues of republicanism, to be replaced by all the pomp and circumstance of a style of leadership the French people had so recently overthrown. To be sure, die-hard revolutionaries would revile Napoleon as a usurper and betrayer of the cause. But the high ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that brought the Republic into being had since been tarnished by the hyper-partisan excesses of the Reign of Terror and the manifest corruptions of the Directory. Moreover, such a view conveniently ignored a key factor in the failures of both previous regimes, namely a refusal on the part of leadership to embrace the concept of a unitary executive. The fear of creating another aristocracy had prohibited such a thing, yet the alternative of rule by parliamentary committee had proven unworkable. Enter Napoleon, who, foregoing the title of king in favor of emperor, managed to sidestep the debate while assuming even greater powers than those of a king. However deceptive, for the masses this sleight of hand promised to fill the vacuum of leadership that threatened to destroy the revolution's legacy. And meanwhile, Napoleon's victories on the battlefield would carry the day. We turn now to this week's reading from Quest for Empire and the particulars of those victories. 2 days after the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon met with his Austrian counterpart, Francis II, in Pressburg, where a treaty was signed on the 26th of December, 1805. The resulting document required Austria to withdraw from the Third Coalition, cede its holdings in Bavaria in Italy, and relinquish dominion over the German states. With his capital in French hands, Francis had little choice but to agree to these terms. The battles of Ulm and Austerlitz stood proof of the dominance of French arms, and while Tsar Alexander refused to ratify the treaty, the Russians had prudently withdrawn beyond the Austrian frontier, thoroughly chastened. Meanwhile, in England, news of the Austrian concessions proved mortal to the Prime Minister William Pitt, who died within a month of the signing. A French continental empire, long feared by the English, was now a reality, and the map of Europe was redrawn to reflect the new order. Among the changes, the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity dating back to the time of Charlemagne, was officially dismantled, leaving a patchwork of unaffiliated German states and principalities. At the outbreak of the war, Prussia, alone among the 5 great powers, had proclaimed its neutrality in the hope that both sides might be weakened by the war, enabling Prussia to step in and dominate the German states. When French forces violated Prussian territory during their rapid advance to the Danube, however, the Prussians secretly made arrangements to enter the war on the side of the coalition. But by the time the alliance was agreed upon, the Austrians had been routed at Ulm, and the opportunity for Prussia to play a meaningful role in the campaign had passed. Even so, the subsequent union of Austrian and Russian forces at Olmütz boded well for an Allied victory, in which case the Prussians might expect to benefit from the success of their newfound friends. Instead, with the resounding defeat of the Allies at Austerlitz, King Frederick was obliged to offer congratulations to the victorious French Emperor. Napoleon, meanwhile, had been fully aware of Prussia's duplicity and held the indecisive Frederick in contempt. Consequently, Napoleon entered into negotiations with a resolve that not even the amorous overtures of Frederick's wife, Queen Louise, could convince him to relinquish. The resulting Convention of Vienna called upon Prussia to cede various principalities for use by Napoleon's favorites, including a number of the emperor's personal servants. Prussia was also required to renounce all existing treaties in favor of a foreign policy wholly consistent with French interests. Prussia's one potential reward for this humiliating surrender was the electorate of Hanover, a substantial prize to be given in exchange for Ansbach and some minor principalities along the Rhine. With triumphant French forces poised on Prussia's southern border and immediate war with France a clear possibility, the terms were approved, and a draft of the treaty was signed on the 15th of February, 1806. When news of the proposed treaty reached England, the British seized all Prussian shipping in English ports, sending Prussia's commercial interests into a tailspin and provoking a widespread anti-French backlash. Where once Napoleon had been celebrated by such influential Germans as Goethe and Beethoven, a nascent nationalist movement now emerged in defense of German self-determination, and Prussian autonomy in particular. Napoleon responded by indicating a willingness to give Prussia greater authority over the North German states, but by then a pro-war faction within Prussia had coalesced around Queen Louise, whom Napoleon characterized as the only real man in the country. Next, he invited the German state of Saxony to join a French-dominated buffer state to be known as the Confederacy of the Rhine, abruptly retracting his offer of Hanover to Prussia and proposing instead to give it to England as a peace offering. The offense to Prussian honor was clear and pointed, and the Prussians responded by preparing for war. Meanwhile, reinstating the very model of dynastic rule that the French Republic had sought to replace, in the aftermath of his triumph at Austerlitz, Napoleon named members of his immediate family to the thrones of France's new vassal states. To his older brother Joseph went the kingdom of Naples. Younger brother Louis became king of Holland, and Eugene Beauharnais, Josephine's son, assumed the title Viceroy of Italy. In a world where strategic alliances were subject to constant maneuvering, Napoleon's first concern was for the loyalty of the new players, and family members represented the most trustworthy prospects. As for establishing independent republican governments, this option had proven unworkable in Switzerland, where the Helvetic Republic had succumbed to its own revolutionary struggles within 2 years of its founding in 1798. To be sure, Napoleon's adoption of the title Emperor of the French was attended by all the conventions associated with monarchy. Yet it is worth noting that he ultimately used such conventions as a means to dominate the ruling families of Europe. Though of lowly origins, by casting himself as the social equal of the high-born, he forced a new awareness on his contemporaries, exploding the myth that kings ruled by divine right or vague qualities of innate nobility, and showing them to be eminently fallible. Thus, the spirit of the revolution was seen to live on, however vicariously, in the example of his own elevation from obscurity to emperor. Fully aware of the power of this symbolism, Napoleon set about the creation of a new nobility from within the army, granting titles, read large hereditary incomes, to the most successful of his generals, as well as a wide assortment of honors to the rank and file in recognition of feats of bravery on the battlefield. For all of his aristocratic pretensions as a political leader, as commander of the French military, he maintained a strict meritocracy, in which his own carefully constructed legend served as inspiration. Although the Prussian king, Frederick William III, had required a good deal of provocation to decide upon war, once the decision was made, he gave notice of his intentions in no uncertain terms. On the 6th of September, 1806, in defiance of the sovereignty of the newly formed Confederation of the Rhine, a Prussian army under General Hohenlohe entered Saxony, and 3 weeks later an ultimatum was sent to Paris demanding the withdrawal of all French forces from Germany. Both actions were clearly intended to redress Prussia's humiliation in the aftermath of Austerlitz, and Napoleon was surprised by the sudden aggressiveness of the formerly pliant king, whom he had strong-armed into a treaty of friendship a year earlier. But Frederick William was no Frederick the Great, whose military genius had established Prussia's great power status a generation earlier. Instead, he more nearly resembled his father Frederick II, who had forced the encounter at Valmy only to march away when the enemy refused to surrender. Whereas a year earlier Prussia's participation in the Third Coalition might well have tipped the scales in favor of the Allies, now, despite the promise of Russian support, Prussia would face the French juggernaut alone. And no sooner had offensive operations been set in motion than the Prussian High Command fell to squabbling over an appropriate strategy. Many of the aging Prussian generals, reluctant to hazard their reputations, were overly cautious in their approach, while younger voices tended to clamor for a reckless advance, eager for the chance to reassert Prussia's former glory. In the absence of strong leadership, the combination resulted in a strategic muddle that would prove the worst option of all. Reinforcing French defenses along the Rhine, Napoleon ordered the Grand Army into action from various bases centered on Munich. Taking personal command on the 2nd of October at Würzburg, he proceeded northeast with nearly 200,000 men in 3 columns deployed in a massive battalion square formation, the various corps arrayed in close support of each other and capable of massive concentration on short notice. Crossing a series of forested hills known as the Thüringer Wald, the French left wing under General Lannes encountered the first resistance near Saalfeld, some 70 miles south of Leipzig and well west of Prussia's natural defensive line along the river Elbe. Here an initial clash took place between the French vanguard and a combined force of some 9,000 Prussians and Saxons, an encounter that quickly revealed the underlying weakness of Prussia's preparations. The Saxons, who had been coerced into an alliance only to discover that their own territory would provide the main theater of operations, proved reluctant allies, and despite a clear advantage in numbers, were soon under heavy attack with the unfordable Saal River at their backs. When French cavalry seized the only bridge to safety, the Prussian commander, Prince Louis, led a charge to regain it, only to be cut down in the effort, at which point his entire force fled the field. Outmaneuvered and outfought, the Prussians lost over 2,000 men, the French some 200. General Lannes' initial victory brought the Prussian command up short, and the next day the outlying Prussian armies were ordered to join the Duke of Brunswick in the vicinity of Weimar, a move that effectively uncovered their most direct route eastward to the Elbe. Exploiting the gap, Napoleon sent 2 corps, those of Davout and Bernadotte, racing north across the enemy's left flank to cut off their likely route of retreat, swinging the rest of his corps westward, where the Prussians were massing between Weimar and the village of Jena. Meanwhile, advancing down the west bank of the Saal, Lannes' corps arrived in Jena on the evening of the 12th of October. At this point, had the Prussians been prepared to go on the offensive, they might have turned the tables on the advancing enemy. With an isolated French corps west of the Saal, and one of their own units poised to strike the French rear, the opportunity offered to cut the enemy's supply line through Bamberg and drive the French eastward, away from their base. In addition, another Prussian army lay to the north, ready to descend upon the French right. Like the Austrians before them, however, the Prussian commanders insisted on calculating French movements on the basis of their own capabilities, and thus were wholly unprepared for the accelerated timetable Napoleon was about to force upon them. Such was their confusion that in the immediate aftermath of Prince Louis's defeat, the Prussian command had little idea of the precise whereabouts of the enemy's main force. On the 13th, Napoleon oversaw the placement of Lannes' corps from the high ground west of Jena, convinced that the Prussians were planning to withdraw and hoping to catch them on the move. Meanwhile, both Davout and Bernadotte had reached the vicinity of Naumburg, well to the rear of the enemy's main force. This was contrary to Napoleon's original orders, which specified that Bernadotte was to halt at Dornberg, approximately halfway between Naumburg and Jena, to cover a potential enemy escape route to the east. While Napoleon made allowance for the possibility that both corps might remain together, his orders indicated that Bernadotte take up his originally assigned position, which he did, marching his troops the 10 miles back to Dornberg, a move that would loom large in the coming battle. Preparations for the battle at Jena continued through the night of the 13th, and early the next morning Lannes advanced with Augereau's corps in support on his left. Attacking in a dense fog over ground cut by deep ravines, the French descended the Landgrafenberg heights and pressed Hohenlohe's armies back across a second height. At this point, Marshal Ney, pressing forward with only his advance guard, was cut off and threatened with annihilation, whereupon the careful orchestration of the French advance was preempted by an improvised rescue effort by Lannes troops. While the isolated unit was recovered, the action resulted in a larger French reversal as the Prussians caught their breath and went on the attack, regaining much lost ground. Prince Hohenlohe failed to capitalize on this success, however, and insisted on a delay to await reinforcements, ordering some 20,000 infantrymen to halt in the open, where for 2 hours they were subjected to French artillery fire. Meanwhile, a precipitous French buildup pushed the Prussians back along the extent of the front, hastening them on their way with repeated charges of French cavalry. By 2:30, despite the arrival of General Ruchel, who made a gallant effort to turn back the French advance, Hohenlohe's entire force had been broken and was stampeding toward Weimar. Not content with less than the complete destruction or capture of the enemy, the French pursued their beaten foe without let-up. While the two main armies slugged it out on the Landgrafenberg, some 13 miles to the north, Marshal Davout had set out from Naumburg for Weimar with around 26,000 men. His orders were to cut off the Prussian retreat, but neither he nor his commander could have known that the Prussian king and the bulk of his army, over 63,000 men, were even then streaming in his direction. Catching the head of the enemy column off guard in the vicinity of the village of Hassenhausen, Davout rebuffed the advancing enemy long enough to prepare a defensive line, before one Prussian division after another appeared out of the fog, seeking to break through to the north. A series of lesser attacks on the French left flank was followed by a concerted Prussian assault upon Hassenhausen, where the French were driven back nearly to the point of collapse before a desperate counterattack succeeded in recovering the village. Much the same movement took place on the opposite end of the line, where a French division enveloped the enemy left, catching the Prussians in a deadly crossfire and forcing them back in confusion upon Auerstadt. Among the Prussian casualties in this phase of the fighting was the Duke of Brunswick, who was carried from the field, mortally wounded. Having borne witness to the advent of a new era in the history of warfare at Valmy, Brunswick had fallen victim to its destructive potential 14 years later. With his loss, all hope of a Prussian breakout in the direction of Magdeburg faded fast. Their covering force routed at Jena, and their main body now driven back at Auerstadt, the entire Prussian army quickly disintegrated, its isolated units fleeing to the northwest in complete rout. While Davout, soon to be named Duke of Auerstadt, would be lauded by his commander for his role in the battle, Bernadotte, despite his proximity to some of the fiercest fighting of the campaign, had spent the day wandering aimlessly between both battles without contributing to either one. By all accounts, his troops did not fire a shot all day, a failure of command rendered all the more egregious as it seemed to be a case of willful neglect prompted by professional jealousy. Indeed, despite Bernadotte's active pursuit of the fleeing foe, his performance during the battle nearly earned him a court-martial. Only the fact of his marriage to Napoleon's sister-in-law, the former Désirée Clary, spared him the full fury of Napoleon's wrath. Even so, the incident created a personal breach that many attribute to Bernadotte's betrayal in later years. In the weeks that followed, very nearly the whole of the Prussian army was captured as the French swept northward in pursuit all the way to the Baltic. By the end of October, Napoleon was in Berlin, where he issued a series of decrees instituting the continental system, a rigorous blockade designed to strangle British trade. If such a blockade were to be effective, however, it would have to include the only major power still opposing the French on the ground. Thus, Napoleon pressed eastward, preparing for a final confrontation with the Russians. Following the French triumph at Jena-Auerstadt, What remained of the Prussian army fled westward in the direction of Erfurt. The Russians, meanwhile, lay to the northeast, and the ensuing strategic situation forced Napoleon to divide his forces. Committing two corps to a vigorous pursuit of the Prussians, the Emperor sent Murat eastward with the army's vanguard to confront the Russians. He himself moved north to Berlin, the better to mediate between his far-flung forces and mop up after the Prussian collapse in Saxony. Eventually starting for Warsaw in late November 1806, he found his troops rapidly approaching the limits of their endurance. In the space of a month, they had fought a major battle, chased the defeated enemy as far as the Rhine, then raced east from one end of the Baltic to the other. Still, Napoleon continued the pursuit, intent on bringing the Russians to battle before the onset of winter. By the third week of December, with the balance of his forces across the Vistula, he ordered a move north from Warsaw, driving the Russians back along a wide front, and coming to rest along a line running roughly from Austerlitz to Braunberg. Here, worn down by sickness, hunger, and simple exhaustion, the army went into winter quarters, the various corps covering vast tracts of the countryside and commandeering all the food and shelter to be found. Napoleon, meanwhile, made his headquarters in a palace in Warsaw, more than satisfied with his prospects. Thus far, the campaign had been an unqualified success, and the coming spring promised a crowning triumph against the Russians that would consolidate his stranglehold on English trade. The future had never looked brighter, and while passing through the town of Czernowzo on New Year's Day, 1807, he encountered a young woman dressed in peasant garb by the side of the road. Having waited for his carriage, she passed a bouquet of flowers through the window and greeted him with the words, "All Poland is overwhelmed to feel your step upon her soil." The daughter of a nobleman who had been killed fighting for Polish sovereignty, her name was Marie Voluska, and she idolized the French emperor as the liberator of Europe and hoped for savior of her country, which had been dismembered under the collective hegemony of Prussia, Russia, and Austria. Later, upon meeting her at a ball in Warsaw, Napoleon invited her to join him in his palace quarters. What followed is the stuff of romantic novels, for Marie happened to be a married woman who had wed a rich Pole nearly 50 years her senior. Any fears she may have had about public censure for her conduct were quickly allayed, however, when members of the provisional Polish government officially encouraged her to accept the invitation and all that it implied, for the sake of her country. Still, honor demanded that she resist even so illustrious a suitor as an emperor, and according to her memoirs, it was only when Napoleon flew into a fit of amorous pique that she gave in to his advances. For Napoleon, the affair was hardly the first since his marriage to Josephine, yet his involvement with Marie was to be more than a mere dalliance. The relationship would indeed influence the cause of Polish independence and lead to the birth of a son, Alexander. The affair was abruptly interrupted, however, when renewed Russian activity at the front compelled Napoleon to take the field despite fierce winter conditions. The Russians, it seemed, were not through campaigning, and on the 18th of January they struck elements of Ney's corps, eventually forcing both Ney and Bernadotte to withdraw southward. Napoleon first assumed that the attack was merely a reprisal for the marauding of Ney's horsemen, but eventually recognized that the enemy was driving for the lower Vistula in an effort to reopen a corridor to Grodens and Danzig. Despite the condition of his army, which had had precious little time to rest and refit, he quickly ordered his troops back into the field and undertook plans to cut the Russians off from Königsberg. Begun on the 30th of January, 1807, the French counterattack got off to a slow start due to poor road conditions, but the Grand Army soon lived up to its reputation for unmatched speed on the march, forcing the Russian commander, Count Levin von Bennigsen, to call a halt to his advance and draw up his army at Jankovo. Here, quickly deciding to abandon his offensive, he faced about, and for the next 3 days, with the French in hot pursuit, raced north to cover Königsberg, outpacing the efforts of some 13,000 men under his subordinate Lestock. On the 7th, Bennigsen arrived at the settlement of Prussich-Eylau and began forming for battle on a series of hills immediately east of the town. On his heels was the French vanguard, which eventually won possession of the village and the shelter it offered against the bitter chill of the coming night. The morning of the 8th of February, 1807, dawned through a dark overcast from which a foot of fresh snow had fallen in the night. Driven by a bitter wind, drifts up to 3 feet deep had accumulated in the Russian camps, where preparations for battle were already well advanced. Beginning at first light, Russian artillery batteries erupted along the entire front, marking the start of what was to be a very long day. Though substantially outnumbered, French gunners responded in kind, and the smoke of battle soon contended with lowering skies to create a nightmarish scene. With only 44,000 men on hand against some 72,000 Russians, Napoleon opted to await the arrival of Ney and Davout, at which point he planned to throw his main force against the Russian left and roll up the enemy line from south to north. About 9:30, Davout arrived in front of the village of Serpollen and immediately went into action, sending his leading division forward. Driving the Russians out of the village, the French repulsed an enemy counterattack and held on, fulfilling the first objective of the battle plan. Meanwhile, however, massed batteries along the Russian center were punishing the relatively weak French left, where Soult's corps lay exposed to a withering bombardment. Aware of his vulnerability on the left, and impatient to deliver a decisive blow, Napoleon decided to forego his original plan and sent Augereau's 2 divisions forward against the Russian center, while the third provided support on their right. Advancing from the shelter of a concealing ridge, the French infantry no sooner came forward than they were subjected to murderous artillery fire. Adding to their peril, a heavy snow squall blew in on a stiff north wind, effectively blinding them while allowing enemy gunners facing downwind to zero in on the dark masses advancing across the plain. Dazed and disoriented as they waded through the deepening drifts, the French units lost contact and veered off course, actually coming under fire from their own guns as French artillery crews fired blindly into the oncoming blizzard. Pressing his advantage, Bennigsen unleashed his cavalry, which came driving down between the foundering French divisions and broke them apart. Augereau himself was wounded in the attack and his corps largely destroyed as a fighting force. At this point, the snow abruptly stopped, and from a small hill near the center of the French line, Napoleon got a clear view of his shattered formations even as the Russian cavalry completed their rout. In response, he ordered Murat forward with 4 divisions of cavalry. Chasing off their Russian counterparts, the French horsemen pressed forward, smashing through the center of the Russian line to create a running melee in the enemy rear. Whereupon the Russian foot soldiers closed ranks and faced about to cut off their retreat. Napoleon now sent the guard cavalry to the rescue, and equal to the crisis, the veteran troopers opened another gap in the Russian infantry line, allowing their comrades to make good their escape and following them back across the center of the battlefield. Meanwhile, thousands of walking wounded, the remains of Augereau's corps, were still struggling through the snow, to be battered about by alternating waves of horsemen. From his hilltop overlook, Napoleon now saw a column of Russian grenadiers emerge from a roiling sea of confusion directly in front of him. Nearby French infantry units quickly swung into action, and the Emperor was soon out of danger. But the threat of his capture had been real, and despite his outward show of calm, there was no concealing the fact that the battle was going badly for the French. His attempted frontal assault on the Russian line having come to grief, he now fell back on his original plan to turn the enemy left. It remained for Davout to carry out the movement, but here again the going was slow and difficult, the French gaining the village of Klein Sausgarten only to lose it to a Russian counterattack. Eventually retaking the village, Davout's troops poured a deadly enfilading fire into the Russian ranks, and by 5 o'clock the Russian left, pushed back beyond the village of Kuchitin, was on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the battlefield, a Russian cavalry attack went forward against the French left, only to be broken up and driven off by Soult's infantry arrayed in defensive squares. Even as the French were scenting victory, however, Russian reinforcements under Lestock arrived on the battlefield, passing behind Bennigsen's line to envelop the French right at Kutschin. Though worn down by days of hard marching, Lestock's 7,000 men pressed the exhausted French back upon Klein Sausgarten to stabilize the Russian line. Now a final scene remained to be enacted in the day-long drama, as Marshal Ney, following hard on the heels of Lestock, arrived on the Russian right, formed for battle, and went forward in complete darkness, driving the enemy out of the village of Schloditten. Though his troops were too few and too weary to hold the place against counterattack, their 11th hour arrival may well have determined the outcome of the battle. For by threatening the main road to Königsberg, Ney's attack added fresh doubts to any thoughts Bennigsen may have entertained about continuing the contest the next day. In any case, the Russian commander opted to withdraw during the night, and thus the Battle of Eylau mercifully came to an end. From a tactical standpoint, the contest was a draw, with both sides suffering horrific losses. 18,000 casualties for the French, and as many as 23,000 for the Russians. Though the Russians abandoned the field, they were able to withdraw in good order, and were in many ways better situated to pursue the contest. Lestock had come into line with his rear guard still on the way, and with Königsberg less than 25 miles off, Bennigsen could anticipate ample supplies and reinforcements. Napoleon, meanwhile, was far from his base, his troops exhausted from a week of fighting and marching under the most debilitating conditions, and any chance of mounting another offensive to drive the Russians from their own doorstep was doubtful. Though he made preparations to continue the fight the next day, upon discovering that the Russians had withdrawn to the north, he made no concerted effort at pursuit. After demonstrating in the direction of Königsberg, the French withdrew to their original line from Braunberg southeast to Osterlinka, thoroughly fought out. For all of its horrific losses, the battle had gained Napoleon nothing, and would leave a lasting impression on him. Years later, from exile, he would claim that it was not the forces of his enemies that had defeated him, but the forces of nature, represented by the sea that girded his empire in the west, and the snow and ice that thwarted him in the east. At Eylau, he came up against that eastern barrier for the first time, and perhaps foresaw something of the fate that awaited him on the snow-bound wasteland of the Russian steppe. In the aftermath of the harrowing Battle of Eylau, Napoleon established a new headquarters in Osterode and set about reorganizing the army and consolidating its position in preparation for a spring offensive. In May, French forces repulsed an Allied effort to relieve Danzig, and the city finally surrendered, securing the French rear and offering up valuable supplies. Danzig would now replace Thorn as the French base. To the east, at Heilsberg, however, the Russians had constructed a vast fortified camp with a complex series of interconnected redoubts. Within the security of its walls, the Allied High Command had spent the winter planning a major offensive, in which Bennigsen was to drive westward across the Passarge River, while another army of some 60,000 men drove east from Swedish Pomerania against the French rear. To succeed, the plan called upon Bennigsen to seize the initiative, which he planned to accomplish by cutting off and destroying an isolated French corps, Ney's, on the east bank of the Passarge. On the 5th of July, 1807, with a force of some 85,000 men supported by another 24,000 under Lestock, the Russian commander set the plan in motion, sending Lestock against Bernadotte at Braunberg and ordering 6 columns forward in a pincer movement designed to prevent Ney from escaping back across the river. Efforts to coordinate with Lestock were bungled, however, and while the attack inflicted heavy losses, Ney managed to reach the safety of the west bank of the river, where he quickly prepared to contest the enemy's passage. His plan for a decisive blow having failed, Bennigsen abandoned his offensive altogether and fell back upon the fortified camp at Heilsberg, leaving a rear guard under Bagration on the far side of the Aal River. On the morning of the 9th, a French counteroffensive began in earnest with the advance of some 13,000 French cavalry upon Auerstadt, where Bagration made a determined fight before crossing to the east bank of the Aal and burning the bridges behind him. Keeping part of his force at Auerstadt, Napoleon sent 3 corps, Marat, Soult, and Lannes, up the west bank of the river with orders to fix the Russians' main body at Heilsberg. Though an initial assault on the Russian fort was repulsed with considerable losses, soon the bulk of the Grand Army began arriving in front of the enemy's stronghold in a steady stream, and at the prospect of being surrounded, Bennigsen slipped away on the night of the 11th, falling back upon Bartenstein. Confident that at some point the Russians would be forced to turn and fight to cover their base, Napoleon proceeded north in the direction of Königsberg, and on the 13th reached Eylau, where partially buried corpses and wreckage still littered the fields, a grisly reminder of the recent battle. Here, learning that Bennigsen was still east of the Aal, he sent Lannes toward Friedland to establish contact and directed Marat north to invest Königsberg. The bulk of his forces remained poised between the two objectives, ready to move against either one as opportunity offered. Bennigsen, meanwhile, apparently unaware that the French had stolen a march on him, raced to join Lestock before Königsberg. On the afternoon of the 13th, arriving on the east bank of the Aal opposite Friedland, he sent his forwardmost units across the river to a position immediately west of the town, where they made contact with Lannes' vanguard shortly after midnight. At this point, the Russian commander thought to check the isolated French corps and continue his withdrawal toward Königsberg along a highway to the north. An existing road bridge was supplemented by 3 pontoon bridges, and throughout the night the army streamed across, creating a considerable traffic jam in the town itself. Situated on a narrow strip of land between the river and a substantial stream, Friedland allowed very little room to maneuver and was quickly overwhelmed by the masses of arriving soldiers. From his vantage point west of the town, Lannes recognized the enemy's predicament and moved quickly to bottle up the Russian movement, drawing out his forces in a line running from the forest of Sortlack on his right to the main road to Königsberg on his left. With only 26,000 men on hand to contain an enemy force of some 60,000, his own line would of necessity be precariously thin. But if he could prevent Bennigsen from breaking out of his bridgehead long enough for the rest of the army to arrive, the Russians would be in deep trouble. Preliminary skirmishing in front of the French position at Postenen, immediately west of Friedland, began well before dawn and quickly escalated into a general engagement as the sky grew light. By 6 a.m., a Russian cavalry attack had driven the French out of nearby Heinrichsdorf, opening the road to Königsberg. But French horsemen under Grouchy soon regained the position to put the cork back in the bottle. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the field, Russian infantry advanced on the forest of Sortlack, only to be repeatedly driven back in close quarters fighting among the trees. By 9 o'clock, Bennigsen had sufficient forces in place to launch a general advance, pressing the French back upon Postenen, and again opening the road to Königsberg. Again the French lines held, however, and again Grouchy's cavalry retook Heinrichsdorf, at which point the Russian commander made a fateful decision. With a full 12 hours of daylight remaining, he opted to go on the defensive and rest his weary troops. In all probability his idea was to await nightfall and withdraw under cover of darkness, continuing toward Königsberg along a northerly route. Such a plan presumed, of course, that the enemy would be content to while away the long summer day in a desultory artillery exchange, a notion scarcely supported by recent experience. Perhaps he assumed that Napoleon was preoccupied with his own advance on Königsberg. Perhaps he had simply run out of ideas. In any case, about noon Napoleon arrived at Postenen with 2 fresh corps, and could scarcely believe his good fortune. Here lay Bennigsen's entire army with its back to the Aal and virtually no room to maneuver. Wasting no time, he brought his reinforcements into line, with Lannes' corps in the center, Mortier on the left, and Ney on the right. His battle plan called for Mortier to demonstrate against Bennigsen's right, while Ney formed his divisions in column behind the cover of the Sortlack forest and rolled up the enemy left. Throughout the afternoon the various units moved into position, while Russian cavalry made a series of probes on each flank. At 5 p.m., the French dispositions complete, a 20-gun battery thundered out 3 salvos to signal the advance. Pushing out of the woods on the French right, Ney's initial attack drove much of the Russian flank guard into an isolated pocket along the river, where they had little choice but to attempt to swim to the safety of the opposite shore. Meanwhile, the attacking columns swung north, rounding an acute loop in the river to advance directly on Friedland. At this point, moving forward along a narrow front, Ney's troops came under concentrated artillery fire and were stopped in their tracks, then driven off in confusion by a well-timed cavalry charge. Moving forward to fill the void thus created, a fresh infantry division under General Dupont came forward with twin batteries of 15 guns each. Combined in a single array in position some 120 yards from the Russian lines, they delivered a well-orchestrated barrage of canister shot, blowing the Russians back as if by a sudden wind. The survivors were soon fleeing into Friedland, where conditions were quickly verging on chaos. To this mounting crisis, Bennigsen responded by ordering the Russian Imperial Guard to repel Dupont, while the Guard cavalry swept down on the French guns. Here again, however, the concentrated firepower of the guns proved decisive, as 2 quick volleys blasted the oncoming charge to pieces. The tactical use of massed cannon in front-line action would originate here. Meanwhile, Dupont drove the Russian Guard back at the point of the bayonet, adding a final note of panic to a scene already grown desperate in the town itself. Crowding toward the river crossings, the Russians would now pay the price for their commander's error, as French gunners zeroed in on the bridges, setting them afire and sealing the fate of those who had yet to cross. By 7 p.m., in desperate fighting in the streets of the town, Bennigsen's entire left flank was destroyed, his men either killed, captured, or drowned as the French pressed on to the banks of the Aisle. Having realized the first phase of his battle plan, Napoleon now sent Lannes and Mortier forward against the Russian right, and in the lingering hours of daylight, the bulk of Gortchakov's corps was systematically cut off and destroyed. Of the approximately 20,000 Russians on this end of the field, a number found their way across a deep ford in the river. The rest put up a desperate fight on the river bank before attempting to swim to the opposite shore. Fought out and exhausted, with small arms fire hissing into the water about them, few would make it to safety. On the extreme flank, some 5,000 Russians managed to escape and, retaining their organization, made a rear guard stand near the river, repelling an attack of Saxon cavalry before Lannes gathered his last available troops for a final charge and sent them fleeing northward. With this final action, the Battle of Friedland, fought on the anniversary of the hard-won French triumph at Marengo, was over, and with it went Russian domination of Eastern Europe. The next day, news of the battle prompted Lestock to abandon Königsberg and race eastward to join what remained of Bennigsen's force as it fled toward the Niemen River. On the 19th, with the French closing in on Tilsit, a Russian delegation came forward to sue for peace. For Napoleon, who had set his army in motion the previous summer, the chance to bring a long and arduous campaign to an end came as a great relief, the decisive victory at Friedland serving to blot out the awful memory of Eylau. In a matter of days, an armistice was signed, and the French and Russian rulers met in an elaborate tent on a raft in the middle of the Niemen. Though no written account of the conversation was made, subsequent events would make it clear that the two autocrats agreed on a plan to divide Europe into French and Russian spheres of influence. When it was over, Napoleon and Alexander had seemingly become the best of friends, and the opposing armies that had been locked in combat some 10 days earlier were now called upon to parade together in a grand display of brotherhood and mutual respect. Having thus subdued the last major continental power to hold out against him, Napoleon thought to have arrived at the threshold of a lasting peace. While he had done his best to charm Tsar Alexander, however, the French emperor proved considerably less cordial to the Prussian king and queen. Determined to humiliate Prussia still further for her duplicity during the War of the Third Coalition, Napoleon dictated crippling terms in which Prussia was to cede a vast tract of territory toward the creation of a Polish homeland to be known as the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. According to the Treaty of Tilsit, France was to make no claims on Russian territory in exchange for Russian compliance with Napoleon's continental system, by which all trade with England was forbidden. Another treaty was signed and kept secret, however, in which something of the nature of the private talk between the Tsar and Emperor would be revealed. By its terms, Russia was to make war on England unless the island kingdom agreed to peace under conditions favorable to France. In return, the Tsar was encouraged to seize Finland from Sweden and expand her territories southward at the expense of Turkey. A masterpiece of Machiavellian power politics, the two documents together would place all of continental Europe under French domination.